We can describe this part of the object based upon some facts that we know about this part. There's physical laws within our universe that as we progress through time, the physical mechanisms within the 3D space cannot do anything outside of those laws. We exist at a certain perspective, at a certain location, at a certain scale of this infinite. I think the most interesting conversations to be had aren't those that involve things like this, where we can't really confirm or deny. Now, let me try this again. So it's not that this relationship is like necessarily outside of our ability to have some certainty about it existing, because I would argue that what I'm trying to outline here is required by necessity, given some facts that we know about reality. And so assuming my facts are correct, and assuming I'm using those facts correctly to deduce whatever structure is allowing reality to exist, then there is a possibility of some part of what I'm describing here being reflective of some fundamental aspect of how reality operates. But what is most interesting, I think, and what is most easily thought about and dealt with, and I don't want to say proven, but internally experienced, I guess, is our brain and the way that we... That's a horrible brain, but it's a brain. The way that we get consciousness. So we're going to be using this model in order to describe how consciousness arises from the physical object of our brain. So just as some review from last time, from the perspective that we're looking at the universe, we have this infinite, unchanging object. And within the object, there are what we would describe from a human perspective, many or probably infinite levels of higher dimensions of what we describe as space. And when we look at a person from some impossible perspective within the universe, if we just look at, say, 4 dimensions with 3 dimensions being space, and then our perception of time being stretched out into a 4th dimension, we would see our life as essentially an object progressing through time. Well, let's take a 2-dimensional example. So let's say we have a 2-dimensional plane here, and we have some object that's stretched out across it. Okay. Now, this is just a line or a squiggle that has some humps up and down, but let's imagine, or let's posit that we can describe this part of the object based upon some facts that we know about this part. And what we'd say a human brain is essentially a very specific object at a very specific place, progressing through space based upon those laws. And when we say progressing, we really just mean moving spatially in a particular direction. And as it's moving in that particular direction, which in our example here is the 4th dimension, or our example here would just be the 2nd dimension that we're traveling along, the brain is changing, and so is every physical part of the object that we're looking at, so even the body, but in particular we're interested in the brain. The brain is changing in particular ways that align with how this universe defines how objects can be stretched out across the space within the universe, right? And so that's to say there's physical laws within our universe that as we progress through time, the physical mechanisms within the 3D space cannot do anything outside of those laws. There's only so many ways that a particular configuration of physical matter can propagate and permutate as time passes. And so that's what we're describing here. And then what happens is you get enough you get a complicated enough structure in, say, our 2-dimensional plane, And what you'll find is that as we're moving from one side of our two-dimensional plane to the other side, and we're kind of tracing this object, the shape that's stretched out across this two-dimensional plane is describing itself in a particular way. I would posit that for every function that arises within reality, so let's just say that this is a function, there is some previous function or multiple functions that this function is derived from. And this rule continues for all functions. And so when we look at the functions that this rule is derived from, or the single function, and it can go the other way as well, where you have one function that from it arises multiple functions, but we'll always find a lower level, from some perspective, function. So we'll always find another object, or not object, but I mean, in this context, we're describing objects, information, and function analogously. They're the exact same thing. They arise from the exact same base thing, which would be the contents within existence that's being acknowledged. So as a result of this layering, right, we have an infinite depth and an infinite height when it comes to everything about our reality. But although there's an infinite height and an infinite depth, we are the object of the brain, the object of the human body has coalesced at a particular place and a particular time, or what we'd say the fourth dimension, along this chain of infinite function. Just because we have an infinite universe, it doesn't necessarily mean that everything imaginable is going to happen, because the infiniteness is defined by the infinite structure of function. And it may happen that as the infinite structure propagates forward, or we kind of, infinitely progress through these layers, they never actually reach particular configurations that we'd expect. We can say that only if we assume that there's an infinite configurability of function. And so obviously that point would have to be argued for or against, because if we only have a limited amount of configurability, or like we only have a limited amount of permutations of function as they arise infinitely, then we would say that there's actually a repeating pattern that we'd see within the infinite expanse of function, because there's a limited amount of permutations that can happen within the function. And as a result of that, you would get a repeating pattern over some amount of time, or some amount of dimensionality of this function chain, where you would see the same kinds of function arising from previous similar functions, and then it would start looping and repeating. And that may be the case. So it can really go either way, but the point here that I'm trying to make is that we exist at a certain perspective, at a certain location, at a certain scale of this infinite either circle of function. So let's just draw that I was kind of describing just now. If there is a limited configurability or permutation of function within our reality, or an infinite, or a completely non-reproducible chain of function, in that there's an infinite permutability of function within reality. And I don't think that we can ever, well, I don't know, maybe that more thoughts need to put into that as to which one it is. But regardless of which one it is, we are at some place in this infinite chain of function, of object, of information that is layered atop previous information. So we can say that, this is constructed of every layer below it, and every layer below it is constructed of some layer below that, and then it just continues infinitely. When we jump to that internal experience, it's assuming something about the brain, right? And I think that this is where a lot of the really interesting conversation comes in, because some would posit that without a sufficiently complicated brain, you can't have consciousness, and others would posit that consciousness arises from a more fundamental element.